I think presidents are basically like great white sharks. They do what they do. Like if you put a seal in the water with a great white shark, the shark will go after it. If you're a surfer in a wetsuit, the shark might think you're a seal. You don't really blame the shark.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Chris Edelson. He's an assistant professor at the School of Public Affairs at American University and the author of Emergency Presidential Power, From the Drafting of the Constitution to the War on Terror. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Let's start with somebody like Obama.
Yes.
Obama last summer was basically about to declare war unilaterally on Syria. Right. You wrote against that power in the LA Times last summer. It infuses your book. Is Obama overly broad in interpreting executive power?
Yeah, I would say he's making many of the same mistakes and doing many of the same dangerous things that Bush did. And what's ironic about that, of course, is Obama's a constitutional lawyer and scholar by background. He used to teach classes on the Constitution at the University of Chicago. When he ran for president in 2008, he said Bush was violating the rule of law. We are going to restore it. We're going to put us back on a track under the Constitution. And I have to say, I was glad to hear that. Turns out during his presidency, I don't think he's followed that. And Syria is one really good example of that.
And Libya is another example.
Libya, of course,
yes. Some of the essay, his defense of that, or his idea of, an executive kill list.
Yes, that's right.
But part of what your book talks about is that this is not, it's new, it's happening now, but it's not exactly new.
Right.
Let's talk about a couple of big examples that are in the book from the past. And one is about Abraham Lincoln and, the suspension of habeas corpus in 9/11, or rather during the Civil War.
Sure, yeah.
So how do you talk about that in the book, and what's the enduring lesson of that?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. One reason I got interested in writing this book is I wanted to understand what's happened since September 11th. And a lot of times defenders of broad presidential power will say, nothing new is going on. This is just what Lincoln did during the Civil War or Roosevelt during World War II. I think that's a specious argument. I don't think it's really right. Lincoln did take some extraordinary measures, as you said, suspending habeas corpus unilaterally at the beginning of the Civil War. He conceded he was acting extra constitutionally. He went to Congress, sent a message to them on July 4th, 1861, and said, I've done certain things, like suspending habeas corpus. He also called up the military, ordered spending for the military, ordered a blockade of the South, all things that are really within Congress's sphere of authority. What he said to Congress is, some of these things were not strictly legal. So he really frankly admitted, I acted beyond my power. And he said, I'm asking you to recognize this was an emergency. And I think he was right. This is one of the rare cases that really was an emergency. The country was breaking in two. And he said, I had to act. Congress wasn't in session. And he conceded that he needed their approval, and they gave it to him. So I think it's different than what's happened now.
And you can also argue, and again, I can realize this going in many different directions, that the Civil War in 1861, say, or 1861 America is different than 2012, 2014 America.
Right.
Talk about Harry Truman and his kind of extraordinary actions.
So that's another key. So the Civil War is certainly one key point when it comes to broad presidential power, though I would argue there were limits that Lincoln recognized. Presidential power since World War II, and really Truman's a good key marking point, has expanded with almost, without the same kind of limits Lincoln recognized. Truman, of course, first sent troops to Korea in 1950 after saying, when the United Nations Charter was ratified, there was a question. Members of Congress said, senators who would have to approve the treaty said, wait, if we approve this, does that mean you'll be able to send troops in unilaterally? Truman cabled back, I think he was in Potsdam at the time, and said, no, I won't. I will always check with you first. In 1947, Congress passed a law that said, the UN Participation Act, that said Congress still has to approve military action. So there's this kind of incorrect belief in American life that the United Nations Charter allows member states to go to war unilaterally. It doesn't. The Charter itself says constitutions still apply. So just because the United Nations authorizes action like it did in Korea doesn't mean U.S. law goes away. Right. The president still needs authority under the Constitution. Truman acted unilaterally. Unfortunately, Congress didn't stop him, and he created a precedent. A precedent, I would argue, is incorrect, but a precedent nonetheless that presidents have followed since then.
And it's one that we're still living under, because there hasn't been an actual declaration, like a flat-out declaration of war
That's right.
since then.
There have been the authorization for the use of military force, but presidents pretty routinely, including Obama almost in Syria, and he sort of reserved the right there, and in Libya, they claim the right to act as Truman did, to act unilaterally in certain cases that I don't think are supported by the Constitution. And Truman, you're right, really started that with Korea.
And you actually have a kind of interesting take on the War Powers Act, which came out of the Nixon era and Vietnam and whatnot, and it's widely seen as an attempt to restrain the president. by saying that they have, if they dispatch troops in an immediate fashion, they have to come back and get authorization from Congress or file a report. It's not clear, Obama didn't do that for the Libya engagement.
He did file a report, but I would argue he didn't follow the act. You're right. Yeah.
But you actually argue that it's unconstitutional, but for kind of novel grounds, not because it limits the president, but
exactly because it gives the president too much power. So the War Powers Resolution is just a law. I mean, laws are laws, but they're subordinate to the Constitution. That's the whole point of Marbury versus Madison. If the War Powers Resolution violates the Constitution, it doesn't apply. And the court critics or defenders of broad presidential power, like John Yoo, who I read about in the book, would say the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional because it limits presidential power. His position is the president can do whatever the president wants in military affairs. My position is actually different. I would say the War Powers Resolution, as you said, is unconstitutional because it expands presidential power. I think the framers very clearly said during the debate in Philadelphia in 1787, the only time when the president can act unilaterally with the military is to repel a sudden attack. The War Powers Resolution, partly because it's not very clearly written, seems, at least arguably, gives more power than that. And to the extent that it does, I would argue it's unconstitutional.
Since 9/11 now, I mean, it's not simply, and some of the cases in your book too, it's not simply about military or actions like that.
Correct.
But since 9/11, there seems to be an even broader kind of expansive understanding of executive power, executive privilege, things like that. Where are some of the areas you see that are not directly related to military engagement or even the war on terror, where the presidency is kind of out of control?
That's a great point. So the obvious, when you talk about emergency power, the first thing you think of is the military, but it doesn't. The Bush administration, for instance, used this kind of power in the area of warrantless surveillance, in the area of torture, in the detention system at Guantanamo. The Obama administration has used it in the killer capture list that you talked about. I think in some ways it supports this metadata program the NSA has been using. Of course, what you said about Syria as an example, that's the military though. So those are some of the areas that leap to mind.
What about, a lot of people on the right especially say the way that Obama is acting in unilaterally refusing to implement certain aspects of Obamacare, delaying this, delaying that, is that part and parcel of this broad move towards a robust interpretation of executive power, or is that something different?
It's separate, I think, but it concerns me for similar reasons. So if you believe in broad presidential power, like the unitary executive theory, which I read about, which Dick Cheney really supports, the unitary executive theory basically says the president, when he's operating in areas of executive power as defined by the president, can do what he wants. Now, I focus on that in the context of national security and foreign affairs, but it has implications in direct domestic affairs as well. And you're right. So when Obama says the Affordable Care Act, I want to put off the employer mandate for a year. Well, that concerns me. I mean, and the reason it concerns me is because the precedent he is setting is that presidents can decide what part of laws they want to follow and they don't.
And now, this is not just about kind of discretion to, focus on certain laws, because we all know that, that the government can't enforce all of the insane laws that it writes every year. So this is not about discretion. This is really a fundamental change in what a law means.
I'm concerned. I guess I won't say unequivocally that I reached that conclusion, but I'm certainly concerned about that. There are defenders of his who argue, well, other presidents have delayed laws, and that's true, it's happened before. Does that make it okay? I'm not sure. And again, and Obama himself will defend it by saying, well, I'm not trying to undermine the law. And of course that's true. He wants Obamacare to work, but the problem is future presidents might have different agendas, and it does concern me.
Well, as a final question, let's go back to something you were saying about President Obama. As candidate Obama, he was really clear on what the constitutional limits of the executive branch were.
Yes.
He gets into power, and suddenly he has amnesia about that. Is there any way to restrain the executive from just taking as much power as they can get away with?
I hope so. If not, then the system doesn't work. We basically have an authoritarian regime. So here's the way I think about it. Because I've been confused about this too. Why was Obama saying this and doing? Maybe it's just hypocrisy. I don't know. It's hard to speculate.
We should give him the benefit of the doubt that he meant it when he said it.
Fair point. Yeah. Absolutely right. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter. At least I've concluded. Here's what I've concluded about it. I think presidents are basically like great white sharks. They do what they do. Like if you put a seal in the water with a great white shark, the shark will go after it. If you're a surfer in a wetsuit, the shark might think you're a seal. You don't really blame the shark. And the framers knew this. The framers said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government and we wouldn't need to oversee government. You cannot assume that any president is going to be anything other than someone seeking power and seeking to advance themselves. So it's the checks more come from Congress, the press, the courts, and the people, I would say. And maybe to an extent, this has happened sometimes, lawyers within the executive branch who are willing to stand up, which sometimes happens.
Well, then, very quickly, final question: like, how do we either put a spine? So I don't know if you can transplant spines or not, but how do we get Congress to have a spine, or how do we elect a Congress that does? Because for all this talk about gridlock, I mean, the real problem is that Congress doesn't do its duty, which is in many ways to restrain the executive branch, or to balance it. And oversee.
It's an important problem, and I'm afraid to say I don't have a great answer. The scholar who wrote the foreword to my book, a man named Lou Fisher, worked for the Congressional Research Service for about 35 years. I think he's fair to say the dean of scholarship in this area, and he's a big advocate of Congress reasserting itself. And I think he's right about that. The problem, as you say, is what I always wonder is how exactly does that happen? I don't know. I think probably this raises probably important problems about larger issues in the system, how members of Congress are elected, the role of money in politics, things like that.
Was there a time, I mean, perhaps in the wake of Nixon or something, was there a time where Congress actually acted in a transpartisan way to restrain the power of the executive?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I mean, you mentioned the War Powers Resolution. That was clearly an attempt to limit presidential power. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was passed in 1978. The Non-Detention Act was passed in 1971, intended to prevent sort of another mass internment. Right. So yes, there have been sort of brief periods like this, maybe a little bit after Iran-Contra as well.
But unfortunately, because it's government, the rules don't work and it's ineffective.
Well, that's an interesting question. I would argue, I guess, that if rules don't work, maybe they can be fixed. And the reason that's a theoretical point, though. And the reason I want to be hopeful, so I want to hope that something can be done. So I guess I would say if something doesn't work, like the War Powers Resolution, as you pointed out, I think it doesn't. But my answer would be, let's make it work. And the reason I say that is because I'm concerned, ultimately, if it doesn't work, there were a couple of law professors who wrote a book called The Executive Unbound after the Madisonian Republic. And their argument basically was presidents are unrestrained. They should be unrestrained. There's nothing we can or should do about it. The law can't stop them. And my response to that would be, well, if that's the case, we don't have a constitutional democracy. So that's my concern.
You're voting straight Putin in the next election.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, we will leave it there. We've been talking with Chris Edelson, an assistant professor at the School of Public Affairs at American University, and the author of Emergency Presidential Power: From the Drafting of the Constitution to the War on Terror. It's from University of Wisconsin Press. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you very much.
Chris, talking to us. I am Nick Gillespie for Reason TV.